I'm the head of the history department. I'm also a specialist in Russian history, which explains why I'm in front of you right now. I want to take a couple seconds to thank the Taft Fund for being the very generous sponsor behind today's lecture. And I also want to thank the history department for putting me in charge and giving me the occasion every now and then to pull my own strings and get good people in, which I've done today. Because today we are very, very fortunate. We're hosting a visit by Professor William Chase of the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh. Professor Chase is a well-known specialist in the field of Russian and Soviet history, and in particular of the Soviet period. He's written two extremely well-regarded books. One, an outright monograph focused on the history of the working class in the 1920s in Russia, and the broader problems of NEP, which I know my students have thought a lot about. And another collection of documents, but interspersed with an awful lot of very interesting analytical commentary on the history of the Comintern, which was an association of international communist parties that in the end becomes run effectively from Moscow. That work focuses on the 1930s. Over the course of a long career at the University of Pittsburgh, Professor Chase has been head of the department, so he's been sharing some of his wisdoms with me on that front. He's been head of the Russian and East European and Eurasian Studies Center at Pittsburgh, which is also something that's allowed him, I think, to become an even more obvious presence in our field. And I have to tell you that he occupies a special place for me because over the years he's been a gracious person in terms of being interested in my work and sharing his advice on good things to do. Right now, he's here in conjunction with his current book project, which I'm going to get the title right. You might have moved.
Changes every week.
Changes every week. Okay. The title, the last time I checked, is very evocative. It's called "Murder Most Sacred, Murder Most Foul." Maybe you can tell us whether that's your own or you've got it from somebody else. No. At any rate, it's a study, "Murder Most Sacred, Murder Most Foul," of the assassination of Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in 1940. But it's told through an analysis of the broader, very complicated international scene of, in effect, communist/Stalinist political culture, which, as we know from our class, those of you who are in my Soviet class at present, was marked by some, in many respects, very disturbing pathologies: scapegoating, witch hunting, conspiratorial theories, and obviously a readiness to commit political violence on a large scale. So through this one story of one incident of political violence, Professor Chase is opening up a broader perspective on an entire culture of politics, and that's where his lecture comes in today. As you can imagine from the focus on Trotsky's murder that takes into Mexico City, we have someone here who studies Soviet history but with a broader view. And in today's lecture, he's going to be discussing Stalinism in a Spanish key, Moscow, Madrid, Mexico City. And he's been taking us into the interconnected worlds of communist culture and the Spanish-speaking societies. Thanks very much, Professor Chase.
Thank you very much, Robert. I always hate those because then you have to live up to them. Okay, well, I too would like to thank the Taft Center and Willard and the History Department in particular. And a lot of you are students, so you do me a favor, you know this routine, okay? In about 30 minutes, one of you wave your hand, okay? And that way I'll know if I'm on track or I should do something. Okay. So, as Willard pointed out, today's presentation is based on a book in progress that uses the assassination, murder of Leon Trotsky, but what I'm really exploring are political cultures in the communist world, let's call it. Okay? That is, in particular, the Soviet Union, Spain during the Spanish Republic and the Spanish Civil War in particular, Mexico during the years of Lázaro Cárdenas, which is 1935 to 40, and then the United States, okay? And how they all fit to the murder would take us far afield, but we'll get to that at one point. I'm going to use a couple labels today. And they're very simple, straightforward, but just so we all agree, because the two groups I'm going to describe don't agree with this all the time. Stalinists, very straightforward. People who adhered to either the Soviet Communist Party or to the Communist International, the common term. Okay? And Trotskyists, who are those people who adhered to their own Fourth International. And one can imagine a fifth may come at one day, who knows. And they represent two, it's almost kind of a symbiotic relationship. They are inseparable from each other because they hate each other so much and because they define themselves against each other. They have very different political weight and political influence. Stalinists are much more powerful. They have a state behind them, whereas Trotskyists have 5,000 people max worldwide in the 1930s. But what interests me about them is how these ideas get exported, because they're exports. Stalinism is an export. Trotskyism is an export. And what interests me is how exports are then adapted by people in their own way. Okay? And so that's what I'm going to try to explore today, looking at really at Spain and Mexico. Okay? And what I in particular want to look at, okay, is the way in which what we'll call Stalinist directives, that is from the Comintern or from the Stalin and the Politburo themselves, play out in the Spanish Communist Party during the Spanish Civil War, which is July 1936 to, well, formally April 1939, and how it plays out in Mexico, in the Mexican Communist Party, from 1935 to 1940. And I want to look at only two campaigns, two policies, if you will. One of them is the Popular Front, okay, and the other is the anti-Trotskyist campaign. And they seem esoteric, but I think it's a good way to get at what's going on in these two cultures. Basically, both the Popular Front and the anti-Trotskyist campaign work nicely in Spain for the Spanish Communist Party, but it doesn't work out so well in Mexico. Okay, they can't satisfy, if you will, the people in Moscow. It creates great political difficulties for them. Now, both of these policies, of course, come out of Moscow. They come out of the Soviet Union, whether it be the Comintern or the Politburo. And it's important to understand just saying a few words about this. Now, Willard and I may teach our courses differently, so I'll let you argue with him after. Okay? But as I see it, there are basically three major policies in the 1930s under Stalin. One of them is state building. Planned economies, economic development, trying to make greater production, that's all part of it. But so too is the reform of the state apparatus, and so too is the effort to create popular discussion and support for a new constitution. So that's one thing Stalin is after in the 1930s. The second is national security. The Soviets were, of course, always from 1918 on, were afraid the capitalist world encircled them. And it did. But they were always much more aware that they believed that the intentions were much more hostile than they often were. But in the 1930s, there were really hostile intentions. I mean, Nazi Germany, Japan in particular, caused great problems for Moscow. And so national security becomes an important issue. This ties us into defense spending, but it also ties us into this fear that there are fascist agents and Japanese agents all over the place. Okay? And the third of these is really centers on how can we improve the quality of communist parties, particularly the Soviet Communist Party. And the way they did that was, of course, through mass repression, but also communist parties in the other parts of the world. And this became important precisely in 1934-35 when they decided to change policies and go to what's called the Popular Front. That is, where communists could, for the first time in years, actually work alongside of and relate to and ally with non-communist parties. Not Trotskyists, but social democrats, socialists, even anarchists at times, okay? And that becomes important to us because this was the way in which the Stalinists sought to create a very clear political identity and a real sense of what we might call Stalinist consciousness, okay? What makes us